My name is Lillian Kwan. And before I say another word, you need to know this. I didn't plan revenge. I planned survival. But sometimes survival speaks louder than revenge ever could. They called me just a nanny. A woman who made soup, wiped sticky hands, and folded laundry like it was my native tongue. A woman who didn't deserve a seat at the table. I never argued. I just smiled and waited. You might actually regret missing this dramatic story. So before you sit down and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. I still remember the first day I walked into the Lee family's home. It was the spring of 2008, and the cherry blossoms were blooming outside their suburban mansion like a scene from a postcard. I wore a crisp blouse, carried my certifications in a plastic folder, and brought a quiet hope that this family might treat me better than the last. The interview was short. Mrs. Lee, a sharp-jawed woman with perfect lashes, barely looked up from her phone. "Can you cook Korean dishes?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. "Even temple style?" "Yes, ma'am." She didn't smile. Her husband didn't speak. They hired me that afternoon. No contract. No warmth. Just, "You start Monday. Be early." Back then, I needed the job more than I needed dignity. My husband had passed 5 years earlier, and I was too proud to ask my children, both settled overseas, for help. I had worked in daycare centers as a cleaner, even briefly in retail. But this was different. I would be living in... They gave me the spare room next to the laundry. No windows. One creaky bed. A small lamp with a torn shade. Still, I told myself, this is just the beginning. I will earn their respect. The children were 4 and 2 years old. Anna and Henry. Anna had wide eyes and didn't speak much. Henry had tantrums like thunderstorms, but they responded to my patience, to my routines. Within 2 months, Henry stopped screaming in the middle of the night. Anna began whispering stories to her dolls again. I remember kneeling on the carpet at 2 a.m., rubbing eucalyptus oil on Henry's chest while his parents argued behind closed doors about investments and brunch reservations. I stayed quiet, invisible. But I watched. I watched how Mrs. Lee would give her children air kisses and disappear for yoga. I watched how Mr. Lee only spoke to the children when they were being too loud during his conference calls. I watched the house grow colder even during the summer months. I did what I was asked, and more. I cleaned the kitchen spotless, reorganized their spice drawers alphabetically, bought my own detergent when theirs ran out, sewed a missing button on Mr. Lee's cuff when the dry cleaners missed it. Not once did anyone say thank you. I think the first time I truly felt like a ghost was during the Christmas of 2010. The Lees invited some colleagues and neighbors over. Everyone was dressed in cashmere and wine velvet. I had baked sesame cookies from my grandmother's recipe and laid them on a small plate on the corner of the counter. When guests arrived, I stood near the hallway hoping someone might ask my name. Mrs. Lee turned to me and whispered, "Can you please not linger in the photos?" I nodded. Quietly, I went back to the kitchen and pretended to tidy the fridge. As the camera flashed in the living room, I could hear laughter. Champagne glasses clinked. Children posed by the fire. I sliced carrots I didn't need to cook just so I had something to do with my hands. I never saw the family album, but I knew my presence had been edited out like a blemish. That was the moment I realized something. I would never be one of them. And maybe I didn't want to be. That night, as I tucked the children into bed, Anna looked up at me and asked, "Why weren't you in the pictures?" I smiled and said, "Because I'm the one who gets to take the pictures, not be in them." She was too young to understand the ache behind my words. The truth is, I stayed because of them. Anna and Henry. Their laughter became my clock. Their growth my seasons. I knew the shape of their dreams before they could describe them. I became their guardian angel in slippers. But the family, to them I was just background. That night, after cleaning up the last wine glass and wiping off red lipstick from the hallway mirror, I sat in my small room and took out a tiny notebook from the drawer. The cover had a drawing of a bonsai tree and a faded gold clasp. In it, I wrote, December 25, 2010, humiliation. Lesson. I must build something they can't erase. Something of my own. That's when it started. The quiet shift. I began waking up an hour earlier, not to scrub, but to read. Investopedia Market Reports, Yahoo Finance. I wrote down words I didn't understand and Googled them later. I began tracking stocks I didn't own and pretending I did. If I had $100, where would I place it? Nobody noticed. Not that anyone cared to look. From outside, I was still the nanny, wiping yogurt off the wall, singing lullabies at nap time, bowing slightly whenever guests passed me. But inside, something fierce was growing. And it was just the beginning. I didn't own a smartphone at the time. All I had was a battered flip phone and a 10-year-old laptop I'd kept from my son's college days. But with that, I built my second life, one no one in the Lee household could see. Each night after the children slept and the house settled into a muffled silence, I sat at my desk with a chipped mug of barley tea. I studied articles about compound interest blue chip stocks, ETFs. It was like learning a new language, one that spoke in numbers but whispered power. I was careful, cautious. I didn't throw money into risky companies or try to chase trends. I looked for long-term value, quiet, stable performers. I began with $200, then another $150 the next month. I skipped new shoes, used my own rice instead of asking for groceries. Every cent was sacred. My first stock purchase was a small stake in Johnson & Johnson. I remember feeling nauseous the moment I clicked buy. But by the next quarter, I saw a few dollars of growth and a few cents in dividends. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Meanwhile, life in the Lee household remained frozen in its routines. Mrs. Lee still went on wellness retreats, often complaining that the staff never truly appreciated how hard it was to maintain her image. She meant me, of course. Mr. Lee didn't bother remembering my name. He once called me Mina, the name of the previous nanny who had quit after a week because she couldn't tolerate being treated like furniture. "Thank you, Mina," he said, grabbing his briefcase. I didn't correct him. Instead, I said, "You're welcome," and wrote it down in my bonsai journal. He doesn't see me. Good. I'll work better in the shadows. The children, however, gave me light. One rainy Thursday, Henry drew a picture of our family. There was him, his sister, and between them, not their parents, but me, with a rainbow above my head. "I put you in the middle," he said, "because you're the one who always shows up." That night, I cried quietly under my covers. Time passed. The stock market dipped and rose. I made mistakes. I invested in a tech startup that failed, lost $82. But I also grew wiser. I learned to diversify. By 2012, my small portfolio had crossed $5,000. It wasn't enough to retire, but it was proof. I wasn't just saving, I was building. And no one suspected a thing. One morning, Mrs. Lee hosted a brunch for her book club friends. I was told to stay invisible. No eye contact. No interruptions. Just refill the mimosas. I did as asked. But halfway through, as I was picking up used napkins, I overheard them. "Honestly, I don't know how you do it," one woman said. "Having someone else raise your kids." Mrs. Lee laughed. "Oh, please. She's just a nanny. They outgrow her in a year. She seems so quiet." "Exactly. That's why I keep her. She doesn't speak unless spoken to." They laughed. I smiled politely and moved to the kitchen. But something in me burned. I had taught Anna to read, Henry to tie his shoes. I had sung them to sleep through fevers, heartbreaks, and thunderstorms. But to her, I was temporary, replaceable. Later that evening, I sat with my laptop heart still tight and made my largest investment to date, $700 in an index fund. I told myself, you don't need to fight with words. Let your actions speak. Let your money grow. Around this time, something shifted in Anna. She started confiding in me. One night, as I braided her hair, she whispered, "Mommy says I should only love her. But sometimes I love you more. Is that bad?" I paused, my hands trembling. "No, sweetheart. Love isn't a pie. There's enough for everyone." She nodded, but I could tell she felt the tug of emotional war in that house. Then came Henry's 10th birthday. The Lees threw a lavish party at a country club. Pony rides, a magician, custom cupcakes with gold flakes. Dozens of kids. And yet, when it was time for family photos, Mrs. Lee called Nanny. "Can you go get the diaper bag?" "But Henry's not a baby," I said gently. "Just go, please." I understood. I wasn't to be in the photos again. I walked to the car, closed the door, and screamed into the steering wheel. They didn't want a person. They wanted a shadow, so I gave them one. That year, I doubled down on learning. I started following financial podcasts while folding laundry. I joined a forum for immigrant investors. I began dabbling in dividend reinvestment plans. By the end of 2014, my portfolio was worth $22,000. That Christmas, instead of giving the children toys, I gave each of them a savings bond in a red envelope. They were too young to understand, but I knew one day they would. Mrs. Lee found the envelopes and rolled her eyes. So frugal. Such a nanny thing. But I wasn't ashamed, because I knew something she didn't. I wasn't just taking care of her children. I was taking care of myself. And someday that would matter. There was a rhythm to the Lee household, and I moved within it like breath, quiet, constant, and necessary. I woke before everyone brewed the coffee. No one thanked me for ironed little collared shirts, packed school lunches with gentle precision. I was a ghost with a purpose, but ghosts have memories. And mine held tally marks not just of stocks and dividends, but of every slight, every whispered condescension. One late evening, while scrubbing red sauce from the dining room chair, I overheard Mrs. I. Lee on the phone. Oh, she's harmless. Probably never finished high school. She folds towels like she's solving a puzzle, but don't let that fool you. She's just a nanny. Just a nanny. I'd graduated top of my class in Seoul. Before emigrating to the U.S., I worked as a part-time economics tutor. But she never asked. No one ever did. That night, I opened my laptop, wiped my cracked hands with a towel, and executed 3 trades that added $600 in value to my portfolio. Not bad for someone harmless. By the spring of 2015, I had amassed over $34,000. Still quiet, still invisible. But my hands, those same hands that peeled oranges and buttoned tiny cardigans, were building an empire of quiet resilience. Then one morning, an unexpected letter arrived at the Lee's mailbox. It was addressed to me. Mrs. Lee handed it over with a raised eyebrow. Looks official. From the state. It was, my green card renewal had been approved. I didn't show emotion, but when I entered my room that night, I danced. Alone. Softly. Like a leaf caught in wind. Freedom didn't shout. It exhaled. Meanwhile, tensions in the house were rising. Mr. Lee was working longer hours. Mrs. Lee was drinking earlier in the day. The children felt it too. Anna stopped asking for bedtime stories. She'd come home from school, drop her bag, and shut her door. Henry developed a nervous cough, one that vanished whenever he was near me. One night, Henry knocked on my door at 11 p.m. I had a nightmare, he whispered. I let him in, tucked him beside me, and he slept like the world had never failed him. But the world had, and I knew it. When tax season came, I filed on my own for the first time. My total income still fell below the poverty line, but my capital gains were growing. I read about Roth IRAs and opened one using a backdoor method recommended in my online forum. For every dollar they spent on champagne, I invested 2 in quiet blue chips. But my heart wasn't made of spreadsheets. It cracked often, especially the day Anna, in a fit of teen angst, screamed, "You're not even family. Why do you act like it?" The house fell silent. Mrs. Lee looked up from her tablet and smirked. She's right. You know, sometimes I wonder if you overstep. I nodded once and walked away. That night, I didn't cry. I bought another $1,000 of S&P 500 index. 2 days later, Henry apologized with a crayon drawing. "You're family to me," he wrote under a picture of us holding hands beside a tree. I framed it. By the end of that year, I hit $50,000. Then came the catalyst. The thing that would turn the whisper of wealth into a silent roar. Mr. Lee lost a lawsuit. His business partner sued him over unpaid contracts. The family began bleeding money. And with that, their smiles turned to demands. Mrs. Lee started skipping my paycheck by a few days. "Just until next week, okay?" she'd say, sipping white wine in yoga pants that cost more than my month's salary. I nodded. Then I bought 2 shares of Berkshire Hathaway. Eventually, she forgot to pay me for 3 weeks. That was the first time I spoke up. "I need to be paid for the work I've done," I said evenly. Her lips curled. "You live here rent-free, Lillian. You get food, a room, and all you have to do is read bedtime stories. It's a fair trade." She smiled like a queen dismissing a servant. I didn't argue. I walked away. And that night, I started planning my exit. But not before I finished what I'd started. Over the next 12 months, I lived even smaller. I cooked my own rice and dried seaweed in my closet. I reused tea bags. Every saved penny went into that portfolio. I learned about fractional shares. I bought dips. I tracked dividends. By spring of the next year, I had crossed $100,000. I sat on the back porch one evening watching the children play. They didn't know this would be one of our last evenings together. I memorized their laughter, etched it into my bones. And I made a vow. They might always remember me as a nanny, but one day the world would know me as something else. The morning I submitted my resignation, the sun was gentle, almost deceitful. I had rehearsed the moment countless times, but when it finally came, my voice was steady, my hands still. Mrs. Lee blinked at me from behind her espresso cup. "Excuse me, I'll be leaving in 2 weeks," I repeated calmly. "It's time." Her brows arched high. "Leaving? You're not allowed to just. You live here. What will you even do?" I smiled gently as if she were a child. "I have plans." The news shook the household. Henry clung to me that night, sobbing quietly as I packed a single suitcase. Anna avoided me altogether. Mr. Lee was curiously silent, almost respectful, though I sensed a tinge of regret in his nod when I passed him on the stairs. I left with $113 and $267, 14 in my brokerage account and a library of knowledge in my head. My next move was deliberate. I rented a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood near a public library and a Trader Joe's. It was nothing grand, but it was mine. No curfews, no sideways glances, no invisible status. In the silence of that new space, I bloomed. I spent hours each day analyzing trends, studying companies. I subscribed to financial newsletters, joined online forums, and even attended a free investment workshop at a local community center where I met Gloria, a retired school principal with a knack for options trading. She became my mentor, my friend, my first real connection in years. "You've got discipline," she told me after I detailed my investing strategy. "That's more valuable than luck." We started meeting every Thursday at the coffee shop near the park. While other women our age discussed grandkids and arthritis, we swapped ETF recommendations and debated the merits of dividend growth stocks. By the end of the year, I'd crossed $175,000. And then came the dip, the glorious, terrifying, once-in-a-decade market crash. Everyone panicked. Online forums flooded with despair. Headlines screamed apocalypse. But I didn't flinch. I'd been preparing for this moment my entire life. While the Lees sold their beach house in a panic, I bought blue-chip stocks at 20% off. I loaded up on tech ETFs that others abandoned. I maxed out my Roth IRA and used every dollar of my emergency fund as a calculated risk. And when the market recovered, as it always does, I rose with it. By the time the economy stabilized, I was sitting on $310,000. The numbers thrilled me, but it was more than that. I felt power, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that listens, waits, and strikes only when necessary. I had never felt powerful before. Around this time, I started journaling just a few lines every day, not about my investments, but about the family I had left behind. About Henry's little dimples when he smiled, Anna's awkward jokes, even the cruel things Mrs. Lee had said. I wanted to remember not to dwell, but to honor the woman I'd been. Then one rainy afternoon, a letter arrived. The handwriting was familiar. It was from Henry. "Dear Lillian, I miss you. Mommy said you were tired and had to leave. I think she's lying. I found the drawing I made for you. I hope you didn't forget me. I still sleep with the turtle you gave me." I stared at the paper for a long time. No tears came. Just a weight in my chest, like a stone you carry without complaint. I replied gently. No bitterness, no blame, just warmth. We began exchanging letters, once a month, carefully curated, sealed in kindness. It was enough. Until one afternoon, 2 years after I'd left, I walked into a local bookstore and saw Mrs. Lee. She was thinner, tired, shopping alone. She didn't see me at first, but then our eyes met. Her mouth opened, then closed. "Lillian," she asked, almost uncertain. I nodded. "I didn't expect to see you here. I smiled politely. I live nearby. She looked around, then back at me. Are you working again? It was a question soaked in assumption. I manage portfolios, I replied. Freelance advisory. She blinked, processing. Well, she said eventually, that's nice. We stood in awkward silence for a moment. Then she said, Henry still talks about you. Tell him I said hello. And I left. I didn't mention the 6 figures, or the index funds, or the fact that I now lectured part-time on personal finance at the community center. She didn't need to know. My life wasn't a performance. It was freedom. A month after the bookstore encounter, I received an unexpected email from Anna Lee. The subject line simply read, Coffee. I stared at it for a full minute, heart pacing slowly, cautiously. Then I opened it. Hi, Lillian. I know this is out of the blue, but I'd like to meet. Just coffee? Nothing weird. I've been thinking a lot. About stuff? About you. If you're open to it, there's a place on Marigold and 3rd. Sunday at 10. Anna? For a brief moment, I considered ignoring it, letting it slip away like so many other unresolved things in life. But curiosity tugged at me, and something deeper. A quiet ache that maybe this wasn't just about them anymore. Maybe this was about me too. So that Sunday, I arrived at the cafe 5 minutes early, chose a corner table, and waited. She walked in wearing a navy coat, her hair shorter now, and shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. Lillian, she said softly, thank you for coming. I nodded. You look well. She laughed dryly. I looked tired. Silence sat between us like a guest neither of us invited. I owe you an apology, she said eventually. Actually, 1,000 of them. I waited. I was a brat. A judgmental, insecure brat. And I saw you as, well, less. Because you were our nanny. Because you were quiet. Because you didn't have a fancy degree or drive a Tesla or whatever. I was awful. I still didn't speak. I was wrong, she added. I stirred my tea. Why now? She sighed. I'm in therapy. My husband left me. I've been reevaluating everything. And I kept thinking about you. About how you handled everything. The kids adored you. You were steady when none of us were. And then you left and it all unraveled. That last line hit like a soft hammer. It wasn't your job to fix our family, she added. But I'm starting to see just how much you carried. Finally, I spoke. It wasn't all bad. No, she admitted. But we made it harder than it needed to be. We talked for over an hour. About Henry. About life. She didn't ask about my finances or what I did now. And I didn't offer. But before we parted, she looked at me and said, I hope someday you'll let us make it up to you. That night, I pulled out my portfolio. $486,000. I'd crossed the halfway mark to $1 million and barely noticed. Because something bigger had shifted. It wasn't about money anymore. Not really. It was about value. About how the world sees you and how you choose to see yourself anyway. That week, I gave my first official seminar at the community center, Investing for Invisible Women. 12 women showed up. 3 were retirees. 2 were single moms. 1 had escaped an abusive marriage and was trying to rebuild. I shared my story selectively. No names. No sob stories. Just facts, emotions, lessons. At the end, one woman stayed behind. You made me feel like I'm not stupid, she said. Like I can do this too. You absolutely can, I replied. And just like that, a new purpose began to take shape. Over the next year, I hosted monthly sessions, built a small online course, created a newsletter with tips and tools. I didn't become famous, but I became known by the women who needed it most. And then came the letter that pulled everything full circle. A formal envelope, embossed, from a law firm, estate of Helen Wu, Mrs. Lee's mother-in-law. Inside was a short note. Helen always spoke highly of you. Quietly, of course. But she watched how you worked. How you raised Henry. She told me once, that woman is smarter than all of us put together. In her final wishes, she asked that you be given something. Enclosed is the deed to a small property in Silverdale. We hope you'll accept it as a gesture not of charity, but of recognition. My hands trembled as I read it again. A house. From the one person in that family who had always met my eyes, even in silence. I visited the place the following week, a humble bungalow with a wraparound porch and lilac bushes. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. I walked through the empty rooms and imagined what I might build. A writing nook, a recording studio for my courses, a tiny garden. As I stood in the backyard, birds chirping overhead, I felt the quiet come full circle. They had called me just a nanny, but they hadn't seen the woman beneath. And now they would. One investment, one voice, one woman at a time. The house in Silverdale wasn't big. It wasn't modern or flashy, but it was quiet and it was mine. I signed the deed with a pen that felt heavier than gold, because behind that signature was the invisible weight of decades of being overlooked, of being underestimated, and of being patient. I spent my first night there sitting on the wooden floor with a takeout container and a single lamp from a thrift shop. I didn't sleep much. Not because I was uncomfortable, but because I kept thinking, what would I do with this freedom? I was 64 now. Technically retirement age. But the idea of retirement bored me. I hadn't worked all my life just to vanish into silence. And I wasn't the nanny anymore. I was something else now. Something I was still discovering. I moved in fully over the next month, slowly furnishing the place with pieces that spoke to me. A secondhand bookshelf, a tea cabinet, plants, a keyboard I hadn't played since I was in my 20s. The house began to feel like an extension of my soul, not a showpiece, but a reflection. One evening, I hosted a few of the women from my investment group. We sat around my new table sipping tea and discussing mutual funds like we were plotting a revolution, because we were in our own way. I always thought finance was for other people, said Teresa, a mother of 4 who'd spent most of her adult life surviving. But now I have an emergency fund and an IRA. It's like I've grown a second spine. We laughed, but it was true. These women were changing because someone had finally spoken to them like they were smart, like they mattered. And in helping them see their value, I was uncovering my own. But just when things seemed to be settling, the past came knocking again. Literally, it was a Sunday morning. I'd just finished my tea when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find Henry. Not a child anymore, a man in his 20s. Taller, broader, still wearing those wire-rimmed glasses he'd hated as a kid. "Hi, Lillian," he said. I blinked. "Henry." He smiled. "I hope it's okay I came. Your address was in my grandmother's papers." I stepped aside and nodded. "Come in." We sat on the porch, the scent of lilacs lingering in the spring air. "I don't know where to start," he admitted. "Start anywhere." He took a breath. "I never got to thank you." "You don't have to." "No," he interrupted gently. "I do. You were the only stable thing in my childhood. When everything else was chaotic, you were just there. And not just there, but calm. Constant." I didn't understand it then. But I do now. My throat tightened. "I also wanted to apologize," he continued, "for not reaching out sooner. I was young, confused, angry at my parents, and somehow that spilled onto you. You didn't deserve it. Children don't owe clarity," I replied. "Adults do." He chuckled. "That sounds exactly like something you'd say." We talked for hours about his life, his job, his therapy, his regrets. He told me he'd read about my community courses online, that he was proud of me. Then he asked the question I didn't expect. "Would you ever consider coming to speak at my firm?" I raised an eyebrow. "You work in finance?" "Real estate investment," he replied. "We do monthly speaker series, mostly dull guys in suits. But your story, your voice. I think people would actually listen." I hesitated. "You really think I belong in a place like that?" He looked me in the eye. "Lillian, you built $1 million portfolio while wiping applesauce off my face. You belong wherever you damn well want to belong." I smiled. A month later, I stood in front of 60 people in a gleaming office tower telling my story. Not just the numbers, the psychology, the loneliness, the resilience, the choice to invest not just in markets, but in myself. I ended my talk with this. Every dollar I invested was a sentence I whispered to myself. "You are not invisible, and neither are you." They gave me a standing ovation. I left the building lighter, not because of applause, but because I had spoken my truth in a room that once would have dismissed me. And I had been heard. Afterward, Henry walked me to the elevator. "You were amazing," he said. I squeezed his hand. "You're not so bad yourself." And for the first time in years, I felt not like a footnote in someone else's story, but like the author of my own. After that talk at Henry's firm, something shifted. Not just in me, in how others saw me. It's strange how one room of clapping strangers can do what decades of quiet dedication never could. Change the way the world frames your story. Over the next few months, invitations began arriving slowly at first, then, like rain in monsoon season. A local library wanted me to give a free seminar, then a community college, then a national women's leadership summit. But what shocked me most was this. People weren't just interested in my investments. They wanted to know how I stayed soft while being invisible, how I remained kind when no one seemed to value me, how I built something beautiful in the silence. And the truth, I didn't have one grand answer. I just didn't let other people's blindness define my self-worth. I remember one talk in particular. A young woman in the audience raised her hand and asked, "How did you know when you were finally enough?" I paused, then said, "The day I stopped asking that question." It landed like a thunderclap. But behind the success, behind the polite handshakes, the rising online following the occasional podcast interview, there was still a bruise named Margaret. Because while Henry and I had found a kind of gentle reconnection, his mother had remained silent. No apology, no email, not even a vague acknowledgement. And I would have let it go. I had made peace with being forgotten, until one day she came to my class. I was in the middle of explaining compound interest to a room full of seniors and single mothers when I saw her. Margaret, sitting stiffly in the back row, arms folded, lips pursed. I kept teaching. My voice didn't falter, but inside everything trembled. Afterward, as people filtered out and hugged me, she stayed seated. I walked over. "Margaret," I said quietly. Her eyes met mine. Something flinched in them, pride or shame or maybe both. "You're very popular these days," she said. "People are talking about your classes, your story." I said nothing. She shifted. "I came because Henry, he talks about you. A lot. He says you helped him. More than we did." Still, I waited. Then she blurted, "I didn't know. About the stocks. About what you were building." "That's because you never asked," I said softly. She looked like I'd slapped her. "I was busy." I know, I interrupted gently. "Busy overlooking the help. Busy assigning value to people based on outfits and salaries. Busy assuming you were the center of every room." She opened her mouth, then closed it. "I'm not angry," I continued. "I was for a long time. But now, I just hope you understand. What you thought was meekness was resilience. What you saw as silence was strategy." Tears rimmed her eyes. She didn't wipe them. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she whispered. "That's not mine to give," I said. "But Henry's trying, and maybe that's enough." She stood, looked around the room, then back at me. "If you ever need anything?" "I don't," I replied, smiling gently. She left without another word. That night, I sat on my porch, watching the wind move through the lilacs. I thought of all the women like me, women who had cooked and cleaned and dried tears, all while the world missed the galaxies behind their eyes. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't even looking for recognition. I just wanted to live the rest of my life fully, without apology, without erasure. I wanted to be a story no one could rewrite. And maybe I already was. Henry invited me to dinner a few days later. It wasn't just him. His wife Elise would be there too, and their daughters Sophie and Isla. It was meant to be a family evening, as he put it. I hesitated before saying yes. It was the first time I would step foot in their home again since I left 5 years ago. Back then I was just the nanny. The woman who picked up the toys, kept the peace blended into the wallpaper. Now the dynamic had shifted and everyone knew it. When I arrived, Sophie opened the door. "Grandma Lila," she squealed and threw her arms around my waist. Her curls tickled my chin. She was taller now, more confident, but the warmth was still there. "Hey, little firecracker," I said, hugging her tight. Isla peeked from behind her sister, clutching a drawing. "I made this for you." I knelt and took it. It was a picture of me holding a book with the words "smart" and "pretty" scrawled in pink crayon. My heart swelled. Inside, Elise greeted me with a hug. A little awkward, a little stiff, but sincere. "I'm glad you came," she said. "Henry's been different lately. And I think it's you. I raised an eyebrow. Different, good. She chuckled. Good, different. Kelmer. Less. I don't know. Burdened. We shared a glass of wine, and for a moment it felt normal. Not perfect, but peaceful. Dinner was roast chicken with lemon and thyme, mashed potatoes, roasted carrots, comfort food. We sat around the table as the girls talked about school and soccer and the class hamster that escaped during math. Then Elise asked, "So, the $1 million portfolio, was that always the plan?" I smiled. No. At first it was survival. Then it became freedom. And later it became identity. Henry leaned forward. How did you learn? Really? I watched. I read. I made mistakes with $100 before I ever touched 1,000. And I trusted time. Time is the only ally you can't cheat. Elise looked down at her plate. I wish I had known sooner that you were doing all this. That you were… What? I asked gently. Not just the nanny. There it was. I sipped my wine. You know I used to hate that phrase. But now, it reminds me of everything I overcame while no one was watching. Henry cleared his throat. We've talked about this, Elise and I. About how blind we were, how much we leaned on you without really seeing you. I nodded. You were young, busy. That's life. But it wasn't fair, he said. I looked at both of them. Fair would have been acknowledgement, kindness, a shared table. But I'm not bitter. Because if everything had been perfect, I might have stayed invisible forever. We lingered at the table, the candlelight casting soft shadows on the walls. Sophie curled up next to me on the couch later and asked, "Are you famous now, Grandma?" I laughed. No, sweetheart. Just finally seen. That night as I walked home, I thought about the arc of things. How you can be overlooked for years, decades even, and then suddenly the light turns and you're standing in the center. But it's not the spotlight that defines you. It's who you became in the dark. I had raised other people's children, cleaned other people's homes, smiled when dismissed, endured when ignored. And in all of that, I had built something no one could take from me. Not the money, not the reputation, but the clarity of knowing who I was even when they didn't. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and messages. Henry wasn't the only one who had been talking. Somehow word had spread. Distant family members, cousins, nieces, a few who had once said things like, "You're wasting your life," babysitting other people's kids, began reaching out. Suddenly I was inspiring, brilliant, ahead of your time. Where were these voices when I was scrubbing floors? Still I smiled politely, replied briefly, and kept my head down. Not out of shame, but because I knew the difference between admiration and opportunism. The mailman even lingered longer than usual. "Heard you made the news," he said, handing me a package with a smirk. Apparently a finance blogger had picked up my story. It wasn't hard to trace. Henry had shared a brief post on LinkedIn praising the wisest woman I've ever known. From there it caught fire. "Self-made nanny builds $1 million portfolio in silence" was the headline. Cute. I didn't need the recognition, but I knew someone who did. So I wrote a letter, not to the press, to a girl named Leah. Leah was a shy, soft-spoken nanny I'd mentored 3 years ago. She worked for a family who barely acknowledged her birthday. She once told me she felt like a piece of furniture that moved. In the letter I said, "You are not furniture. You are not invisible. You are the quiet foundation beneath everything they take for granted. And when you build your life outside their shadow, do it loudly." I added my favorite quote, one I had pinned above my tiny desk for years. "They didn't see you coming. That's your power." A week later, Leah called me crying. She'd opened her first investment account. Meanwhile, at the community center where I used to volunteer, they invited me to speak to a group of immigrant women looking to learn basic finance. I almost declined. Public speaking had never been my strength. But then I thought about all the women who had sat silently in kitchens and playrooms, their dreams tucked between diaper changes and dinner prep. So I showed up. I wore the same navy blazer I used to wear to the library. And I started with this. "My name is Lila Alvarez. For most of my life, people called me just a nanny." What they didn't know was that while they talked over me, I listened. While they dismissed me, I studied. And while they climbed ladders, I built mine in silence. The room was silent. Not out of disinterest, but reverence. I walked them through compound interest like it was a bedtime story. I explained ETFs in plain English. I told them not to chase hype, but to honor consistency. And I reminded them that power often grows where no one is looking. Afterward, one woman approached me. Her name was Amina. She was 52, a housekeeper. She said, "My son calls me old lady. Thinks I don't understand anything." I took her hands. "You're about to prove him wrong." Later that night, I passed by the playground where I used to bring Sophie and Isla. The swings creaked in the breeze. A young nanny sat on a bench scrolling on her phone, the toddler at her feet babbling nonsense. I recognized the look on her face. Tired. Forgotten. I smiled and kept walking, but in my heart I whispered, "They may not see you now, but you're not just the nanny. You are the roots of everything that blooms." It was around this time that Helena reached out. Not a call, not even a voicemail. She sent a text. "Hey, can we talk? I feel like things got weird. The girls miss you." I stared at the screen unmoved. Got weird? That's what you say when your Wi-Fi drops, or you bump into your ex at the grocery store. Not when you stand by while someone is humiliated in your home in front of your children and called just a nanny. But I took a breath. Pride had built me, but grace was part of my foundation too. So I texted back, "Yes, I'm available Saturday, noon, at the park." The park was neutral ground, safe, and somehow poetic. That Saturday, I wore jeans and a soft blue sweater, the same sweater Sophie used to tug on when she was nervous. I waited on the same bench where I used to unpack juice boxes and Band-Aids. Helena arrived alone. She looked thinner, tired. Guilt etched into her face like cracks in a porcelain cup. "I messed up." She began sitting without waiting for my permission. I didn't know everything. I didn't say a word. Just let her talk. She told me that after Henry's post went viral, people started asking her about me friends, co-workers, even her boss. One woman at her firm said, "Wait, that Lila, the one who took care of your kids. Why did you ever let her go?" That stung apparently. A lot. She finally Googled my name and was shocked to find articles, interviews, and even a brief podcast I'd guested on. "You sounded so poised," she said, her voice soft. I tilted my head. "Did you expect me to stutter through life, Helena?" She winced. "I think I just—" She trailed off, then sighed. "I never saw you as someone with ambitions." That's on me. There it was. The admission I had waited years for, even when I didn't know it. We talked more. She apologized sincerely. Told me the girls still asked why I didn't come around. She'd told them I was busy now. That I had important things to do. She wasn't wrong. Still something in me softened. Not because she deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved freedom from carrying her weight. "I'll think about visiting," I said, standing. She nodded. "Thank you." As I turned to leave, she called out, "You were never just a nanny." I paused, smiled, and said over my shoulder, "I know." That evening, I sat at home sipping tea and flipping through a worn notebook, my first finance journal. The one filled with scribbled notes about dividends and risk ratios. On the last page, there was a quote I hadn't seen in years. "Let them underestimate you. Just make sure they do it from behind." The next day, I went back to the community center to speak again. This time, Amina brought her sister. Leah showed up with cupcakes. And a young woman in scrubs named Junie told me she'd opened a Roth IRA. I'd never felt wealthier. That night, I lay in bed and thought about Sophie and Isla. Whether they'd remember me years from now, not as the woman who packed their lunches, but as someone who showed them that quiet women can shake the ground beneath empires. Helena's apology was a relief, but it didn't change the fact that I was no longer their nanny, and that role, for better or worse, had shaped me. But the truth was, I had changed too. I wasn't that woman anymore. I had stepped into something far more powerful, a voice that resonated beyond nurseries and school pickups. The next week, I received an email from a producer of a financial literacy podcast. They had seen clips of my community center talk online, a clip where I'd said silence doesn't mean ignorance. Some of us build empires in whispers. That line apparently hit a nerve. They invited me to guest star. I accepted. The studio was simple, tucked between a yoga class and a sandwich shop downtown. I wore a white blouse and dark jeans, no jewelry except a silver ring I bought when my first stock hit 100K. The host, Olivia, was sharp, one of those millennial finance whizzes with a charming laugh and a laptop sticker that said, "Compound interest is my love language." We hit it off. She asked me how I learned to invest. I told her about YouTube tutorials in the laundry room, about budgeting notebooks hidden between fairy tale books and grocery lists, about listening to CNBC on earbuds while stirring soup. She leaned forward. So, why stocks? Why not real estate or crypto? Because stocks require belief, I said. Belief in growth, in momentum, in recovery. That felt familiar. Listeners loved it. The episode went viral. Suddenly, I was invited to speak on panels, at women's business luncheons, at finance clubs in universities, and always they introduced me as Lila Lynn, former nanny turned millionaire investor. Some called it a Cinderella story, but I never lost a shoe. I walked out with my head high and both heels on. At one panel, a woman in her late 60s approached me. "My daughter thinks I'm too old to start investing," she whispered. "But I saw you, and I thought, why not me?" I took her hand. "It's never too late to bet on yourself." That week, I started a weekly newsletter, Quiet Wealth. Every Friday, I'd send tips, real stories, and financial resources specifically for women who had been overlooked, undervalued, or underestimated. In less than 2 months, we had over 80,000 subscribers. Some were former housekeepers, some were teachers, some were retired nurses. All were hungry for a future no one handed them one. They had to build brick by quiet brick. Still, not everything was tied up with a perfect bow. One day, while grocery shopping, I bumped into Ethan. He looked surprised, maybe even uncomfortable. "Leela," he said, as if unsure whether it was me. "Ethan," I nodded. We stood awkwardly in front of a display of bagels. "I heard you've been doing really well," he offered. I replied. "Thanks." There was a pause. I'm sorry about how things ended." I looked him in the eye. "You and Helena made your choices. I made mine. But I'm not bitter." He exhaled. "That's good." Then he added almost shyly, "Sophie's taking an economics elective now. She says she wants to work in finance." That surprised me. "She talks about you," he added quickly. "She remembers the piggy banks, the investment snacks. She even said, 'Lila made money sound like magic.'" My throat tightened. I nodded. She was always the curious one. Before we parted ways, he said, "If you ever want to visit." I smiled. Maybe someday. As I walked away, I thought, forgiveness isn't a door you walk through. It's a window you choose to open just enough for light to slip in. And in my world, there was finally a lot of light. The idea to start my own financial education foundation came while I was sipping tea on a quiet Sunday morning. The kettle still whistled in the background, but my mind was already racing because I had just read another heartbreaking email from a woman named Gladys. She was a 57-year-old housekeeper who had worked for the same family for 20 years. She said, "I know every inch of their house, but I don't even know how to open a savings account." That sentence haunted me. There were too many Gladyses in the world. So I drafted a plan. A small nonprofit, grassroots, focused on low-income women, particularly those in domestic or caregiving roles. We'd offer workshops, free online resources, and small group mentorship programs. I named it the Quiet Rise Project. It felt right. Like everything I'd done up until now was preparation for this. At first, I reached out to friends, colleagues, even some of the mothers I used to work for. Some ignored me, some donated out of guilt. But a few, just a few, offered real help. Legal advice, community spaces, seed funding. And with that it began. The first session was held in the basement of a local church. 12 women showed up, nervous, silent, unsure if they belonged. By the end of the session, they were sharing stories. "I thought only men could do this. My husband doesn't know I'm here. But I'm tired of asking for money to buy groceries. I never finished school, but I understand compounding now." Their laughter was real, their pride even more so. And in each of them, I saw pieces of myself, uncertain, underestimated, but deeply resilient. By the third month, we had wait lists. We moved to a community center. Local media started covering our work. Even the mayor's office reached out for a potential partnership. But the moment that shook me most was during a live-streamed Q&A when a young nanny named Pilar raised her hand and asked, "How did you survive the years when no one saw you?" The room went quiet. I took a breath. I saw myself, I said, even when it was hard, even when the mirror only reflected exhaustion. I held on to the idea that I mattered, that my mind mattered, and I made decisions from that place quietly, consistently. Pilar cried. So did I. The clip went viral again, and that's when Helena reached out. This time not through email. She showed up unannounced at one of our public events. I was mid-conversation with a volunteer when I noticed her standing near the coffee station holding a bouquet of tulips. It was surreal seeing her there among posters that read, "You are worth investing in." She waited until I was free. "I don't expect anything," she said softly. "I just wanted to see it with my own eyes. Everything you've built." Her voice cracked. "I was so wrong about you. We were so wrong." I didn't speak. I just looked at her, seeing not just the woman who had once dismissed me, but the weight of her own guilt. "I didn't come for forgiveness," she continued, "but I wanted you to know that Sophie keeps a photo of you on her nightstand." That nearly undid me. She placed the tulips on the table and turned to go. "Helena," I said, stopping her. She turned surprised. "I hope," I began carefully, "that you're treating your current nanny better." She blinked, then gave a short, sad smile. "We don't have one. No one stayed after you." I nodded, then turned back to my work. That night, as I walked home, tulips in hand, I thought about how sometimes closure isn't a door you slam or a letter you write. Sometimes closure is a moment you live and then move past. I had lived it, and I was already ahead. By the end of that year, the Quiet Rise project had helped more than 500 women open investment accounts, eliminate debt, and begin side businesses. Some of them became mentors to newer attendees. A few had left toxic marriages. One had even run for city council and won. But the ripple effect didn't end there. One afternoon, while reviewing a grant proposal at the library, I was interrupted by a gentle knock on the table. A young woman stood there, maybe in her early 20s, holding a slim portfolio folder. "Are you Clara Dawson?" she asked, her voice careful, respectful. I nodded slowly. "My mother asked me to find you," she said. "Her name is Teresa Holloway. She said she took your first budgeting class in that church basement. It changed everything." Teresa Holloway. I remembered her. Small voice, big eyes, lacked confidence in her math, but made up for it with persistence. "She's starting her own group now," the daughter continued. "Financial literacy for immigrants. She said she wouldn't have dared if you hadn't shown her how." I stood there stunned, not from pride, but from something deeper: legacy. It was working. The investment account, the viral fame, the portfolio, they were all tools. But this, watching women lift others as they rose, this was the real empire I had built in silence. I invited the young woman to sit. We talked for 2 hours. She left with a copy of our advanced training curriculum. Another seed planted. But for all the wins, the real test came when I was invited back into the world I had once been excluded from. A corporate investor group in D.C., filled with executives, analysts, and advisors, asked me to speak at their annual symposium on undervalued voices in the financial ecosystem. They had no idea how poetic that title was. When I arrived at the venue, I scanned the room. Suits, pearls, champagne. I had once wiped spit up off the children of these people. Now they handed me a lapel mic. I opened with the story of my first paycheck as a nanny. I saved half of it, not because I had a lot, but because I knew I wouldn't always have a little. The room stilled. I went on to describe how I built my portfolio, not by chasing hot stocks, not by taking wild risks, but by being consistent, curious, and patient. And then I said something that landed harder than I expected. "You all know how to build wealth with money." I had to build it with disrespect. The silence was thick, and then a slow clap, then more, then a standing ovation. After the talk, several attendees asked me to consult. One offered me a board seat on a nonprofit. Another asked if I'd consider co-authoring a book. I said no to most, because I knew the real work wasn't on panels. It was in community centers, libraries, late-night Zoom calls with single moms who still believed financial freedom was for someone else. Still, I accepted one offer to be interviewed on a national morning show. It was surreal. Lights, makeup, a producer feeding me timing cues. And then the host leaned in and asked, "So Clara, what does it feel like to go from just a nanny to a financial icon?" I smiled. It feels exactly the same. I still wake up at 6. I still pack my lunch. The difference is I'm not invisible anymore, and neither are the women I serve. That clip became a soundbite on TikTok. Millions watched. Thousands commented. And buried among them, one username caught my eye. Sophie Ann writes. She had shared the video with a caption. She read me bedtime stories and built her empire in silence. I want to be like her. My breath caught. I clicked the profile. Poems, essays, reflections on class and womanhood. Some tagged with, "Inspired by Clara." It was Sophie. She had found her voice. And somewhere quietly, she had forgiven me for disappearing from her childhood. That night, I wrote her a letter. A real one. On paper. No email. No performance. Just words. I told her how much she meant to me. How every decision I made leaving building teaching was a seed from the time I spent with her. That she was the first person who ever looked at me like I could change the world. And now I mailed the letter the next morning. No return address. Just her name and city. I knew she'd get it. Whether she ever replied, I wasn't sure. But it felt like something sacred had been returned to me just by seeing her words on screen. Weeks passed. I was on the subway one rainy afternoon carrying a box of notebooks for a workshop. The car was nearly empty except for a young man tapping on his phone and a woman sitting across from me. I glanced up. Her eyes locked onto mine. Sophie, older now. Her hair shorter, more serious. But those eyes, the same ones that once begged for just one more story before bed. She stood, walked over, sat beside me without a word. Then, "I got your letter." I held my breath. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small, a worn photo of us from years ago. I was holding her, both of us in aprons after baking cookies. We were covered in flour. "I kept this," she said quietly. "Even when I was mad at you." I didn't speak. My hands trembled just slightly. She looked out the subway window. "I hated that you left. I didn't understand it. But when I read everything you'd been doing, I don't know. It was like I saw you for the first time." Tears gathered in my throat, but I bit them back. This moment wasn't about me crying. It was about her feeling safe enough to share. She added, "I started investing last month." A soft laugh escaped me. "In what?" "Index funds. ETFs. I read your blog, took your course, and I applied to Columbia's School of Social Work." My heart burst. "Sophie, that's incredible." She smiled. "I want to work with girls like me. Ones who get left behind in big houses with big secrets." And that was it. That's when I knew I had done more than teach finances. I had made space for healing hers, mine others. She reached out, squeezed my hand, then stood. "Next stop's mine. But maybe we can get coffee sometime." I nodded, too choked up to speak. She exited with a quick wave. I watched her disappear into the crowd umbrella opening like a blooming flower. My little girl, not by blood, but by bond, now blooming in her own light. Back home that night, I sat down and opened a fresh journal. At the top of the page, I wrote, "What's next?" The answer came before I even finished the question. A nationwide initiative. Quiet Rise would go mobile. We'd set up in schools, shelters, remote towns. I'd partner with educators and small banks. Create videos for women with no time and no mentors. I'd make sure no woman who wanted freedom had to earn it in shame or in silence. As I planned, my phone buzzed. An email. Subject line, "You've been nominated." I opened it. It was from a national financial organization. I had been shortlisted for the Trailblazer of the Year award. The irony wasn't lost on me. A woman who made her fortune without a title now being honored by people who once wouldn't have handed me their car keys. But I accepted. Not for the spotlight, for the symbol, for every woman who's ever been just a nanny, just a secretary, just a cleaner, because we were never just anything. We were strategy, resilience, and untapped potential. The night of the award, I wore a simple navy dress. The same earrings I had bought from a street vendor 10 years ago. As I stepped onto the stage, I didn't give them a speech about money. I gave them a story. About a little girl who believed in me before I believed in myself. About a family who dismissed me, and about how their indifference built the fire that changed hundreds of lives. I ended with this: wealth isn't what you accumulate, it's what you liberate. Thunderous applause. But all I could hear was the faint memory of Sophie's laughter as she ran around the living room in socks 2 sizes too big. I walked off the stage into the arms of women who were once strangers, now sisters. We weren't just building portfolios. We were rewriting our stories. Together. After the awards ceremony, I expected the buzz to die down for the waves to settle. But instead, something unexpected happened. My inbox became a river of voices. Hundreds of women, some grandmothers, others, college students, many single mothers or women recently divorced wrote to me. Not to congratulate, but to confess. I've been working 3 jobs and I don't even know where to start. My husband handled all the money. Now I'm 58 and lost. I've always felt stupid around numbers. Your story made me cry. I read every line, and I saw myself in every one of them. I set up a reply system. Not automated real answers, even if short. I launched Quiet Rise. Letters, a weekly newsletter where each issue shared a story, a tip, and a spotlight on one woman's journey. But something else shifted too. The Parkers. The family I once worked for suddenly wanted to reconnect. Emails came, an invitation to Thanksgiving. Then a request for help on their financial planning. It was surreal. I didn't say no, but I didn't say yes. Instead, I replied to their eldest son's message with one sentence. I'm not your nanny anymore, because I wasn't. I was Lillian Kwan, founder of Quiet Rise, keynote speaker, financial advocate, and most importantly, a woman who reclaimed her worth. Weeks later, I was invited to guest lecture at a university. The classroom was packed. Students with laptops, open phones, recording eyes wide. I told them the truth. That I had built my fortune quietly while cleaning juice stains and folding tiny socks. That I bought my first share of Apple stock the same week I was docked, pay for being too emotional with a child. That dignity is not a salary. It's a decision. And when one girl raised her hand and asked, "Would you do it all over again?" I didn't hesitate. Yes, I said, because the silence gave me space to study. The underestimation gave me room to rise. And the love I had for Sophie, even unreturned at times, taught me the value of long investments. I closed that talk with something I hadn't planned. A memory. Of Sophie dancing on my feet when she was 4. Of her whispering, "Lillian, when I grow up, I want to be like you." She had no idea then that I was becoming something worth emulating. Now she did. Now they all did. As I left the campus, a group of students ran up asking for a photo. I agreed, laughing. I never expected to be someone people Googled. That night, I went home to my quiet apartment. The same one I'd lived in for 15 years, rent-controlled, still smelling faintly of lavender and books. I looked around at the stillness, and I smiled. Because the world now saw me not as just anything, but as everything I had always been. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting to be noticed. I was too busy noticing myself. They called me invisible. They called me replaceable. They called me just a nanny. But what they never called me until it was too late was unstoppable. Because while they were counting status, I was counting stocks. While they saw an apron, I saw opportunity. And while they slept in silk sheets, I studied compound interest under a flickering hallway light. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about realization. That power isn't always loud. Wealth isn't always flaunted. And the most dangerous woman in the room is often the one everyone ignores. So if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or made to feel like less, just remember, the most explosive revenge is not shouting, it's showing up wealthy, wise, and unbothered. Follow Grace's truth and every day listen closely, because the next whisper you hear might be the sound of your own rise.